Good evening. It's time for us to begin tonight. If you'll be finding a place to join with us and opening up your Bibles to the book of John. We are continuing our study of the Gospel of John tonight. And it's last week, of course, we paused for the Thanksgiving devotional that we had, but it was a good spot for us to pause and to miss a week if we were going to skip over a week, because we finished up with what we've been on for the last several weeks, and that conversation that Jesus was having with the disciples in the upper room. And we're in John chapter 18 tonight, where they've left they're going to leave the upper room finally and go out into the garden. And really the idea that we want to focus on tonight is following when difficult. And of course things are getting really difficult right now. It's already started with what has gone on in that upper room, and the conversations that they've had that have been really tough for them to deal with. But it's even going to get more difficult now with what they're going to have to view and be a part of. The disciples are talking about, of course. Part of that is that they're still struggling with what's going on, not really understanding what's going on. And as they continue to see things transpire that go so against what they fundamentally thought about the Messiah, they know that Jesus is the Messiah. They're just confused as to what exactly that means. And sometimes what is going to happen with them is, because of that, they're going to try to figure things out on their own and try to do some things their way. Even not only the disciples, but Caiaphas tonight is going to make some decisions based on what he wants. And when we try to make decisions based on what we want, it's easy to sometimes when things are difficult, but it's not going to lead down the path that we want to go. And following Jesus and focusing on him whenever difficulties arise is what we need to do. It's complicated and it's hard, but it's what we must do. So in chapter 18 and verse 1 is where we'll begin tonight, and we won't get all the way through chapter 18 tonight, but we'll talk a little bit about some events that happens. Verse 1 says, when Jesus had spoken these words, and the words that we're talking about, of course, is this conversation that he and the disciples have been having the last, since chapter 13, really, chapters 13 through 17. But when he'd spoken these words, specifically, the prayer that he prayed for them in chapter 17, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden where he and his disciples entered. And so, if you go, I know sometimes probably I'll get tired of hearing me say when we went to Israel, but some of y'all have been to Israel and you can appreciate it too, and maybe some others of you get a chance to one day. But when you go there, one of the places that we got to go was on the other side of this deep valley where there's this, it was dried up at the time, but little brook bed down at the bottom of that little valley. And it's not very far across, but on this one hill looking out in front of you there is Jerusalem and the old city, the wall around the old city. And then up on this other hill where they're at, even today, there's a big grove of olive trees. And, the topography has changed. That entire hillside now is basically a giant cemetery, and there's above the ground mausoleums and tombstones and those kinds of things all over that entire hillside. But it's still pretty easy to sit there and think about this moment. And there's some trees in the area there that they say date back to the time of Jesus. And of course, one of the things you have to know is that the Roman Catholic Church, everywhere they think that there's something happened, they build a big giant church there on top of it and those kinds of things. But they'll tell you that this is the church that this is the tree rather that Jesus leaned on when he was praying. Now, I don't know how they know that. It wasn't like, Davy Crockett carved that he killed a bar, and whatever. Jesus didn't carve on the tree, J. Christ prayed here or anything. There was nothing of that nature. So, but it's that old at least. And to sit there, and that's what we did. We just spent a moment kind of just sitting there with our thoughts, thinking about this moment. Now, John's not going to give, in fact, the garden, Gethsemane, that's what Gethsemane means, is olive press. So that's what we're talking about, is a garden that is a grove of olive trees, and a really pretty spot on the side of the hill over there. John's not going to give us near as much details about Jesus' time in the garden as Matthew, Mark, and Luke does. Of course, Matthew, Mark, and Luke doesn't give us as much detail about what happened in that upper room as what John has. But we're outside of the city walls of Jerusalem, up on this hillside across the valley from it, and in this garden where Jesus is ultimately going to pray. You recall from the other gospel accounts, and he's tears, sweat drops like blood, begging God for this cup to pass from him, but willing to do what it is that's the Lord's will. In verse 2 it says, "Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples." And we hadn't really seen Judas since back in chapter 13, whenever he was sitting at the Passover table with Jesus and the disciples. And you'll recall that, he dipped the piece of bread in the lamb gravy bowl and gave him to eat, and told him what he was doing to go, and he left. And the disciples, the rest of the other 11, thought that Judas was leaving because, he had the treasury bag, and maybe it was that he was going to buy some supplies that they needed or something of that nature. One of the times I've been working really hard the last week or so planning sermons for next year, and one of the things that I'm wanting to do is to do I'm going to do a series of lessons on the 12 disciples. And when we study Judas, one of the things we'll talk about is just how in high regard he was among the disciples. They had really, we look at Judas and we think, Benedict Arnold, Judas, there's some of those names that have just been associated with bad, but they thought only good of him. Judas has gone in the meantime and made the arrangements about betraying Jesus. One of the things that's cool about this verse is he talks about Judas came to this place because it says he knew the place, for Jesus met there often with his disciples. And it is it's interesting to notice how many times that you'll see in the Gospels. We mentioned this a couple weeks ago in a sermon on Sunday mornings, but how often that Jesus went away to spend some alone time, just him and the Father, in prayer. And this was a place that they were familiar with, that he had gone to his disciples with, undoubtedly to pray and to some of those kind of things. Maybe there's some thought that maybe during the days leading up to all of this taking place, Jesus spent several days in which he would go into the city and he would teach at the temple, and then he would go out of the city, and maybe he went all the way over to Bethany and stayed with his friends Mary and Martha and Lazarus, or a lot of people think maybe they just camped here because that was something that was common to camp on this hill over opposite from Jerusalem during this time when everything would have been so filled. But this was a favorite spot of Jesus. And again, those of you, Johnny, that have been there, you can say why it'd be a favorite spot. Not only because of the location, but because of just how beautiful a place it is. So he knew this was a place they went, and that's why he brings them there. It says, so Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. They came to this place. They were armed. It's almost like they've got their pitchforks and their torches, and it's a whole posse that they've rounded up to come and get Jesus. And it might seem odd to us that they would send soldiers that were armed and all of this that's going on to just arrest Jesus. But remember, what the thought process was that the Messiah was, is that He was going to be a military leader. And, even in the Gospel of John, you think back to like chapter 6, where you had this large group of people that were willing to make Jesus their king. And so I'm sure, and the disciples, that's what they were thinking, that this is what Jesus was going to do. He was going to have this army that was going to overthrow the Romans. Remember when He had the triumphal entry, as we call it, that all the people are lined up on the street and they're shouting Hosanna, and they're ready for Him to do this. So at the very least, they knew that there was a dozen or so men with Him, and so if they put up a fight, it could be something that they would need some help with. But even more so, maybe that there was more than that out there ready for them, that they were assembling their troops, getting ready to attack. But they came there with the purpose of getting Jesus. And verse 4 says, "Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to Him, came forward and said to them, 'Whom do you seek?'" Now, all the way back at the beginning of that upper room scene that John describes for us in chapter 13 and verse 1, you remember that's the way all that started, was Jesus knew that the time was at hand. Jesus knew all of this was going to happen. And one of the things that He made very clear in His conversations with them in that upper room was the fact that I'm telling you what's going to happen because I want you to know that I know. This isn't taking me by surprise. This is not something that I'm in control of all of this. And so all through that conversations, when He said things like, "I'm going away, and where I'm going you can't go at this time," and those kinds of things, He's telling them this is going to happen. Jesus knew what was coming. And so He asked them, "Who do you seek? Who are you looking for?" Now He knows who they're looking for, but He's wanting to have this conversation with them now. In verse 5 it says, "They answered Him, 'Jesus of Nazareth.' Jesus said to him, 'I am He.' Judas, who betrayed Him, was standing with them." So Jesus says, "Who are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth," which from a human standpoint, that's who Jesus is. He's Jesus, the son of Joseph, as He's called. He's Jesus from Nazareth. He's a man, and that's the man that we've been sent here to arrest, is Jesus of Nazareth. And His response, and first thing tonight, Richard asked me about this very part of the text. He said, "I was reading chapter 18, and he described this part. What's going on there?" Well, one of the things that's going on here is something that has often been seen in the Gospel of John, and I've tried to point it out every time that we could. But Jesus' answer to them, when they said Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus said to him, our English translations say, "I am He." But like a lot of other times, that He has been added. In my Bible, I've just taken a red pen and marked an X through it. If you're looking at something besides the little booklets I've given you, it might be that it's in italics because it's been supplied by the translators. But what Jesus literally says is, "I am." Now, those of you that have been in John all this time that we've been studying it will know, but for the sake of maybe some others, when all of these Jewish people, and these soldiers, by the way, are not Roman soldiers, these are Jewish soldiers, temple soldiers. When all of these Jewish people heard, "I am," what's the first thing that would go through their mind? God. Why would God go through their mind when they heard, "I am"? Huh? That's what He called Himself. Remember Moses at the burning bush? They asked, "Who sends me? Who do I tell them? What's your name?" "I am. I am that I am." You tell them I am has sent you. And so this is a cool verse because you see that human side of Jesus that we're really able to see in this garden setting in the other gospel accounts. That human side of Jesus that doesn't want to go through this pain and knows this is going to be tough. But you're also seeing the divinity. I am, he said. And then he points out the fact that Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. He was standing on the opposite side of where he should have been standing. But Jesus is the man Jesus, but he's also divinity. In verse 6, when Jesus said to them, I am, now the translation says, I am he, but when he said, I am, they drew back and fell to the ground. And this was specifically, Richard's question was, why did they fall back to the ground? And the real answer, Richard, is, I don't know, because it didn't tell us. But it could be that they were getting down in position, because when Jesus said, I'm the guy, then remember they came out there with weapons and with torches and with a posse. They think there's going to be a fight, a struggle here. So this isn't just some guys out here camping. This is the guy we're looking for. We're here to arrest Jesus. Who are you? Well, I'm Jesus. If this was a Western, what would happen next? It's the gunfight at the OK Corral, right? So maybe they're getting down for that. I think another option would be that they're in awe. And I think this would fit more in line with the Gospel of John, because these other times when Jesus has called himself I am, people have either been in shock, or they've been impressed, or they've been confused, or whatever, because when they heard someone say I am, they're saying he's claiming to be God, and their immediate action is to drop down and fall back. Now maybe it's to get in fighting detail, I don't know, but I think maybe it was because of his answer and what that would have meant to them. Either way, they knew it was more than him just saying, I'm the guy, you know. They knew that there was consequences to that answer. So Jesus asked them again, whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus answered, I told you that I am he, so if you seek me, let these men go. And these men that he's talking about are the disciples. You know, these guys didn't have anything to do. They're not the ones that you're looking for. I'm the one that you're looking for. So let them go. Why would Jesus be so adamant about wanting them to be let go? He didn't want them to be hurt. Remember, he talked about in his prayer, I hadn't lost any of them except for the son of perdition. He didn't want them to be hurt because he's just spent all these chapters previous talking about he's got a different mission for them, right? His mission was to go to the cross and die. I don't want that to happen. He'd been praying for that not to happen, but if it's your will, I'm willing to do it. But that's not Peter's mission. Peter's got something else that I need him to do, and it's not down a cross. John's got a different mission, and it's not to down a cross. Now, all of them but John are going to end up dying for the cause of Christ, but that's not their purpose now. I've got a mission for you, and that is to carry on this work that I've begun, see? And so he's trying to help protect them. If you seek me, then let these men go. And he said this was to fulfill the word which he had spoken, of those whom you gave me, I have not lost one. He didn't want to lose any of them, and that's what he said back in chapter 15. He didn't want them to get killed because he had chosen them to go and bear fruit. And then Simon Peter, having a sword, and you can read more about Simon's sword that he has in Matthew 16 and in Luke 22, where they're leaving the upper room, and you know, Peter's one of those guys, of course, that is, all the disciples, I think, were this way, but Peter especially, you can tell, feels like he needs to protect Jesus, right? There's times in which, you know, that he's, like in Matthew 16, and he's just flat told Jesus, you're not going to die. And Jesus has to say, get behind me, Satan. One of the things on The Chosen that I think that they've done a good job of is portraying this kind of mindset that they would have had of, this is the Messiah, and I'm willing to lay down my life for the Messiah. I'm willing to protect him. And did Jesus need their protection? And how many times had Jesus have protected them? How many storms at sea and those kinds of things. But anyway, that's what's going on. So Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Now, I've got written on, I don't know if you can see it up there, I've got written on there he was a fisherman. Why did he cut off his ear? Well, yeah, because he missed his neck. He was not a ninja. Peter was not a ninja. This was not expert sword fighting, and I meant to take your ear off. He was probably nervous. When I was in preaching school, one of the guys that I was in school, he was a grade behind me, but he was a former SWAT, I don't know what they called it, captain. He was the leader of the little SWAT unit in Valero, I think was the name. It's a suburb of Los Angeles, basically. And he would talk about how that the SWAT officers were the best of the best. And he said, we'll go to the range every single day. And he was talking about all the things that they would do to try to, scare each other or hide and jump up to try to mimic a live shooter situation and, train for those kind of situations. He said at the range, guess what our accuracy rate was? And I said, and I may get the numbers off just a little bit, but it was something like 99.3%. I mean, they're right on. He said when we go to a real active live shooter situation, they have to account for all the bullets that they shoot there. He said, guess what our accuracy rate is in a live shooter situation? And I said, what? And I'm thinking it was something like 42.3%. And these are guys that trained every day. That's why I've always said, no offense, if somebody comes in the building and starts shooting, I'm just going to jump in the baptistry because y'all may be more deadly than the shooter is. I don't know. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that people that really train for this, that are really good, that adrenaline rush makes their accuracy go down. Peter's not used to pulling out a sword and fighting with somebody. And as a fisherman, he probably is pretty good at throwing a net, not too good at throwing fists, and he's ready to fight. He thinks that none of these disciples thought that they were signing up to go to preacher school. They thought that they were joining the army. This is the volunteer National Guard armory that's going to step up and throw the Romans out. This is the Minutemen of the Revolutionary War. We're just going to take our squirrel guns and we're going to go to battle. And he had the sword. We sometimes give Peter, and we're going to talk about it as we move forward in this text, but we sometimes give Peter a kind of a bad view of, he was scared and all of his denials and all that, but Peter was ready to fight. I don't think fear or cowardice is what causes him to deny later on. We'll talk about that when we get there. John does throw in this fact that the servant's name was Malchus. Why would John give us that piece of information? Well, I don't know that that would have been why. Maybe so, but why is John writing this book? So that they might believe. It's John 20, 30 through 31. If you really want people to believe you, if it's a true story, do you have details? You ever ask your kids, where'd you get that sucker? Somebody gave it to me. Who? Oh, I don't know who it was. It was somebody, though. Yeah, that bowl that you got it out of, maybe. But if it was the Mamaw gave it to me, or the clerk at the grocery store, whatever, that's a different story. Well, it could very well be that when John is writing this, that there's some of Malchus may still have been alive, but some of his relatives could have been alive. You can go check it out. Ask them what happened, And those details help us to see the validity of what he's telling. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword in its sheath. Shall I not drink of the cup the Father has given me? And that's what he's already talked about in chapter 12, at the end of chapter 12, about the need to drink of the cup the Father had given him, verses 23 and 27. God sent me to die. The Father sent me to die on a cross. He didn't send me to kick the Romans out of town. I know that's what y'all want, but that's not what I'm here for. And I've tried to make it as plain to you as I can, but you're just not getting it, and that's okay. You're not going to get it until after the resurrection, but you need to understand that that's what's happening is what needs to happen. In verse 12 it says, "So the band of soldiers and their captains and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound Him." And your translation may have something like the Roman cohort or something like that. That's not in the original language. These soldiers would have been the Jewish soldiers of the temple. It's the same word that's used back in John chapter 7 whenever the religious leaders sent the temple guards to go and arrest Jesus, you remember, and they wouldn't do it. It's the same people that he's talking about here. So they arrested Jesus, they bound Him. First they led Him to Annas, and he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Annas was high priest from 4 A.D. to 16 A.D. He was the father-in-law to Caiaphas, who was 18 to 36 A.D. He was the high priest. What happened is that you were at a point where the Romans were appointing the high priest that they wanted. And when they appointed Annas, it started a series of events. You know, it's one thing to have power, but when you really have power is when you have power and you can pass it on to who you want to, right? Well, that's what Annas was given. And you don't have to write all this down. I'm not going to leave it up that long for you to, but you can do it pretty easily. And I know you may not can even read all of that. This, though, is a list of from 6 A.D. all the way down to 63 A.D., all the high priests. And the different colors that you'll notice, Annas at the top, Annas ben Seth, ben just means son, so he's the son of Seth. But notice all the orange on the right side that were directly his sons. And then there's so many of the other guys, like there's a couple of guys with purple and a couple of guys with blue and a couple of guys with pink. It's all in the family. So Annas is kind of like the godfather. And he's putting people where he wants them. And when favor would run out of one guy, he'd remove him and he'd put the guy in that he wanted. And it was kind of a family deal here. But he was kind of like the godfather of everything that was going on. And whenever they would lead him to Annas, because even though he wasn't really the high priest, Caiaphas was the high priest, but it was one of those like wink, wink, nod, nod. We know who's really calling the shots around here. You know what I'm saying? And so that's why they brought him, Jesus, to Annas first. Remember back though in chapter 11 and verse 50, it was Caiaphas that said it'd be better for one man to die than for the whole nation to be destroyed. And he didn't really know how true he was talking about. He was thinking about politically, but really the idea that Jesus' death is going to keep us all from dying because of our sins. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Remember, we talked about at the very beginning, and we've noticed it a couple of times since, that John doesn't call himself by name. He's the other disciple, or the disciple whom Jesus loved, or the disciple who leaned upon his breast, or one of those kinds of things. So Simon Peter's following Jesus, and another disciple, we would assume that to be John, this other disciple's with him. One of the cool studies that you ought to do sometime is go through the Gospel of John and follow. I wouldn't say it was a key word, but notice how many times it talks about following. And some people are following Jesus, and some people are not following Jesus, and some people start following Jesus and turn away from Him, and some are following Him for the wrong reasons, and some of those kinds of things. But Peter's following, and so did this other disciple. And since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. So he had some friends that allowed him to get into the proceedings there. But Peter stood outside the door, so that other disciple, we assume John, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. So John walks right in because he knows the high priest. And he looks around, and Peter's still out there. And he goes up and he says, look, that guy, he's with me, okay? So just let me, all right, well, if he's with you, then he can come on in. And you kind of get the notion that John is Peter's not too sure he wants to follow right now. And John's kind of dragging him forward as they go. But Peter does go in with John, and it's there that some things begin to happen. Verse 17, the servant girl at the door said to Peter, you also are not one of this man's disciples, are you? He said, I am not. Now, remember, Jesus had told Peter, when Peter's saying, hey, even if everybody else denies you, I will stay faithful. I will follow. Even if it means being put to death, I will stick with you. And Jesus said, before the cock crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And I'm sure, the text doesn't tell us, but I'm sure Peter's reaction was, did you hear what he just told me? Of course, that's not going to happen. But here he is. And again, some of us kind of sell Peter short. I don't think he's a coward. Remember, he drew the sword first. He was ready to fight. I think probably, this is maybe not be a good theological word, but it's a good West Tennessee word. I think he was bumfuzzled. I think he was ready. The Messiah is going to lead us. And if it means me dying, I'm going to draw my sword and I'm going to serve right beside him. But when Messiah holds out his hands and says, all right, tie me up and take me with you. Wait a minute. I left my family business and my wife and my village and everything that I've ever known, and I've been following you around for probably about 3.5 years, and all this time thinking you were the guy, and I'm ready to die for you, and you're just going to turn yourself in? Now, listen, I'm ready to die for the cause, but if you're going to give up the cause, what am I doing here? I'm sure not going to give myself up just so I can die with you for no reason, just to become a statistic, right? So I think he's bumfuzzled, and I think he's probably a little bit bummed out, and he's probably disappointed in Jesus to some extent, which is what happens when we make up our minds what we want Jesus to be or how we want the situation to go. We're talking about following when things are difficult. We know how we want it to play out, and it doesn't play out that way. Are we going to pack up our toys and go home? Or keep following? I don't know this guy. And maybe Peter's even in his mind saying, I don't know this guy. He's not the guy that I thought he was. I thought he was Messiah. But Messiah is not supposed to turn himself in, see. If this is what Jesus is going to do, then no, I'm not one of his followers. Now the servants and the officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. So here's the scene. We've got Peter inside the courtyard, and he's already denied Jesus once, and there's a bunch of people standing around this fire that they built to warm themselves. And now, with Peter outside, we're going to shift back to inside. And the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching, and Jesus answered him. So now that we're back inside here, he's going to start questioning Jesus about what's going on with what he's been doing. And Jesus is going to answer him, say, I have spoken openly. And think about all the times that Jesus had. Remember John chapter 7 and 8 was that the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths, and everybody's in Jerusalem. And remember his brother said, if you're really the guy, why don't you go down there? And he does. And there was that huge debate, all these opinions about Jesus. And Jesus is there in the temple openly discussing with everybody what's going on and who he is and who he's not. In chapter 12, Jesus was back at the temple there in Jerusalem in front of everybody at the time of the Passover feast. And He's talking about, here's who I am and here's what's going to happen. Jesus is saying, everything that I've taught openly. What have you been teaching? Well, everybody knows because I've been doing it in front of everybody. So there's no reason for you to question what it is that I'm teaching. I've taught in the synagogues, and He has. Everywhere He's gone around the synagogues and taught. I've taught in the temple, and He has. In the temple, He's in front of mass crowds there where all Jews come together. Everybody knows. If somebody doesn't know what's going on about me, it's not because I've been hiding what's going on. I've said nothing in secret. Everything I taught was wide out in the open. So why do you ask me? Ask those who've heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. It's no secret what I said. It's no secret what I've taught. And so if you want to know what it is that I'm teaching, go ask all those people. And there's a multitude of people that you could ask all over Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem and Galilee, everywhere you want to go. There's people that know what it is that I've been teaching. So in verse 22, when he said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand. Is that how you answer the high priest? Now, the word that's used here, struck him with his hand, is actually a word that means to strike someone with an open hand. What would we call that? Slapping. Now, I don't want to be hit by nobody, but I think all the guys will amen this, even internally, maybe not, if you don't do it. But there's something different about being slapped, right? I mean, you're talking about low blow and condescending. Is that the way that you're going to talk to the high priest? Now, how are they talking to him? See, they don't mind roughing him up. They don't mind talking to him disrespectfully, but don't talk to us that way. And this is just, of course, the beginning of what all they're going to do to him. So Jesus answered and said, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? That's a pretty good question. If what I've said is wrong, then tell me how it's wrong. What did Jesus say? I've taught openly. I went to the synagogues. I went to the temple. I went in front of where lots of people were gathered. Everybody knows what I've taught. If that's wrong, tell me how it's wrong. They couldn't tell him how it's wrong because it wasn't wrong, though. But if it's not wrong, then why are you striking me? See? And it's because they've already made up their mind what's going to happen here. Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. So now he's going to send him to the real high priest. Caiaphas is done. I've seen all that I want to see and heard all that I want to heard all I want to hear. Now we're going to send him to the real high priest, and we're going to really start the proceedings of what's going to go on. But now we're going to shift the scene back to outside again, where we have left Simon Peter warming by the fire. And as he was standing and warming himself, verse 25 says, so they said to him, you also are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I'm not. That would be denial number 2. And I've often wondered if there was at any point where Peter's like, oh, that's what he said I would do. Or if he's just so caught up in the moment he never really thinks about it. He says one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man who Peter cut off, Malchus, remember, asked, did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. So there's the third time that he denies it. And remember back in chapter 13 and verse 38 is where Jesus had told him this was going to happen. Now John doesn't tell us this little fact, but if you read about this in other gospel accounts, you'll find that one of the things that it says is that when he said this third denial, that Jesus turned and looked at him. And there's lots of debate and lots of people write opinions about what it is that they think, how that looked. That maybe he looked at him with an angry look, or maybe a disappointed look, or maybe a sad look. But imagine the emotions, that the highs and the lows that Peter has gone through at this point, and how at the beginning of the night, when they're sitting around that table eating the Passover feast, how there's no way that he thought he could get to this point. But Peter had made up his mind. See, we often will talk about the Jews, the religious leaders, and how they had made up their mind about what Messiah was going to be, and how it caused them to not be able to accept Jesus, to do the things that they did. But it's true of all of the people, the disciples. The reason why that they're responding the way they're responding. Why did Judas, why did he go and betray Jesus as he did? Because John tells us he was a thief, and he was stingy, and he wanted money. And maybe that's the reason why he kept following Jesus, is because Jesus is going to be, he's going to be the king. And if I'm in his, listen, it's one thing to carry around the money bag of a traveling preacher. If I'm the treasurer for the king, I'm going to really have money, right? Peter and the disciples had made up their mind who Messiah was going to be, and he was going to be this military leader that was going to save them from the Romans. And things, it's hard to follow Jesus when things get tough, but especially if we've made up our mind already of who Jesus is. And we'll say something, I can't believe God would. Or I don't think God would care about, or some of those kinds of statements. And it's dangerous for us to start trying to make God in our image rather than us be allowed to be made in His image. When things are tough, what we've got to do is focus on Jesus and keep following Him. And one of the things you'll notice, this other disciple who's unnamed, who we're pretty sure is probably John, Peter's going to deny Jesus and he's going to go off, Peter's going to deny Jesus and he's going to go off sorrowful. All the other disciples have run off. We don't know where they're at this point. There's one that's going to keep following Him. He's followed Him all the way to the high priest. He's going to follow Him all the way through the mockery of trials that Jesus is going to have. He's going to follow Him all the way to the cross. When Jesus is going to look down, there's going to be one of these 12 men that have been with Him all this time that's going to be there. And it's the disciple whom He loved. And when we get to the very end of the gospel, Peter and Jesus are going to take a stroll on the beach. And Peter's going to have some questions asked of him, and he's going to be confused about some things. And they're going to turn around, and guess where John is? He's still following Jesus. And that's what we've got to do. We may not understand it. I don't know that John understood it any more than any other ones did. We may not understand it, and we may not like it, but we just got to keep focusing on Jesus and following Him. So next week we'll pick up there in verse 28 of chapter 18, and now that we've had the religious leaders, the Jewish leaders, talk to Jesus about what's going on, we'll get to the political leaders and have Jesus before Pilate next week. Before we turn off, those that are watching online, we appreciate you being online with us and hope that you can come be with us at any time here in person that you can. For those of you here, before we're dismissed here in just a moment, Brent is going to lead us in a closing prayer. But before he does, we're going to